Hello, YouTube. You've probably heard of the paradox of tolerance, famously proposed by Karl Popper. In fact, there are various paradoxes of tolerance that are discussed in the literature on tolerance, and I will outline them in this video. I'm drawing here primarily from John Horton's article, Three Paradoxes of Tolerance. Now, before getting into what the paradoxes are, we need to specify what exactly tolerance is. So, broadly speaking, tolerance involves accepting or permitting something of which you disapprove. So there are essentially three features of tolerance. There are three components of it. So first of all, there is the opposition component. To tolerate X, I must in some sense be opposed to X. So X is an action that people should not perform, a belief that people should not hold. I disapprove of X. It wouldn't really make sense to say that I tolerate something if I'm just perfectly happy with the thing. Second, there is the power component. So I believe that there's some relevant group that has or could have the power to suppress X. We can stop people from doing X. And then finally, there is the acceptance component. I believe that we should not exercise the power to suppress X. There are positive reasons for permitting X that outweigh whatever reasons lead me to be opposed to X. Now, of course, this characterization is very vague. What kinds of sort of interference would count as intolerance? I mean, certainly if I'm in favor of prohibiting X via legal punishment, I don't tolerate X. But, what about things like social ostracization or, deplatforming people who defend X? I mean, there are many costs that could be imposed on a person beyond legal prohibition. For much of this video, we won't need to settle these issues because the paradoxes of tolerance arise given this more abstract characterization. Now, many philosophers take it that tolerance is some sort of virtue, right? That we should aim for a tolerant society, that this would be valuable in itself. But taking tolerance to be a virtue, to be something that we should aim for, leads to these various puzzles, which we will now outline. Okay then, so let's start with the first paradox, the most famous paradox. This was the one stated by Karl Popper, that a tolerant society cannot tolerate those who are intolerant. So, as Popper puts it, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. Now, this idea is often raised in the context of debates about free speech. So people will sometimes claim that, okay, given that we value a society that tolerates different ways of life and different ideologies, we may legitimately impose limits on the expression of intolerant ideologies if we grant freedom of speech to those who are, opposed to these very freedoms, to things like freedom of speech. Then they may use this in such a way as to erode the freedom in question by promoting authoritarian ideologies. So, maybe freedom of speech actually requires us to restrict the freedom of speech of those who would speak out against it. Maybe it requires us to actually restrict the expression of certain intolerant ideologies. Now, it's worth noting, actually, that Popper himself did not interpret the point in this way. Popper explicitly says that it would generally be unwise to suppress intolerant ideologies where those ideologies can be countered by discourse. The problem with intolerant ideologies that teach their followers, as Popper says, to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. So basically, we have the right to suppress intolerant ideologies when those ideologies move from debate into violence. So this doesn't really, at least as Popper sees it, doesn't really have much to do with freedom of speech. So as he puts it, I quote, "As long as these intolerant minorities discuss and publish their theories as rational proposals, we should let them do so freely, but we should draw their attention to the fact that toleration can only exist on the basis of neutrality, and that our duty to tolerate a minority ends when the minority begins to act violently." So it's specifically, when he says we should not tolerate intolerance, what he's basically saying is we shouldn't tolerate violence. Now, I mean, framed in this way, of course, it's maybe not so clear what the puzzle here is supposed to be. Um, the way that Horton interprets this is that what Popper shows is that toleration cannot be unlimited. We cannot simultaneously tolerate X while also tolerating the forcible suppression of X, the violent suppression of X. Because to tolerate X means that we must be opposed to the forcible suppression of X. So we can't have a society which simultaneously tolerates homosexuality, for instance, while at the same time allowing violence against homosexuals. Right? If we tolerate homosexuality, we have to prevent violence against homosexuals. But I mean, the thing is that I think there'd be relatively few people who would want to claim that it is a virtue to tolerate literally everything. I mean, you know, the sort of point of tolerance is, well, we want to allow different viewpoints, we want to allow different ways of life, provided these don't coercively interfere with others, right? Like, of course, once you start like actually, you know, beating people up, right? That goes beyond the limits of what we're willing to tolerate. So I suppose the more controversial claim then, and I mean this is the way that this paradox is usually interpreted, is that we can't tolerate intolerant ideologies in themselves. So intolerance of intolerant ideologies is necessary in order to maintain a tolerant society. And this includes the expression or promotion of intolerant ideologies, even in discourse. I mean, this has maybe the character of more of a puzzle, given that the mere expression of an intolerant ideology does not in itself prevent other people from doing anything. So, you know, a homophobe who argues in favour of outlawing homosexuality is not, in virtue of this alone, preventing anybody from practicing homosexuality. So that the paradox of tolerance interpreted in this way is that the tolerant society cannot tolerate the expression of, for instance, homophobic views. And the reason why is that the expression of homophobic views will ultimately lead to the suppression of homosexuality, because by expressing these views, by promoting these views, they may become increasingly popular, and once they become popular enough, then that will lead people to forcibly suppress homosexuality. It will lead people to act on those views. So, you know, by expressing these intolerant ideas, we end up paving the path to an intolerant society. Tolerance of different ways of life can't extend to tolerance of intolerant ideas. Now, a couple of points to make about this. First of all, we should note that this rests on an empirical claim, and it really isn't at all clear that the empirical claim in question is true. So the claim is that if we tolerate intolerant ideologies, if we tolerate the expression of intolerant ideas, this is going to lead to the disappearance of tolerance. But, I mean, must it? I mean, presumably there's actually many ways in which an intolerant ideology might be combated. You know, there are, like, if we're dealing with people who are arguing in favour of an intolerant position, well, one thing we can do is argue against them, right? We can present further arguments in response to them, and that might well be sufficient to convince other people not to adopt the position. In fact, this is, you know, there are even other ways to counter intolerance when the intolerants are resorting to literal violence. I mean, the mere fact that one group uses violence and other groups do not, that doesn't in itself entail that the violent group will successfully achieve their ends. I mean, imagine a case where the broader society has become sufficiently sensitive to violence that violent action only makes them less attracted to the ideology in question. So this is one problem, right? Is it's not clear that the empirical claim is actually true, that the expression of intolerant ideologies would lead to the disappearance of tolerance, or must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. A second difficulty concerns, I suppose this is perhaps a more conceptual problem here. It concerns who exactly counts as intolerant, and I think this perhaps brings out the paradoxical character of the limits of tolerance, because the worry here is that in a context where intolerance is suppressed, the very characterization of some group as intolerant may itself be an intolerant act. So if we're saying, you know, look, okay, we're imposing certain limits to tolerance, right? We're saying we're not going to tolerate everything, right? Tolerance has limits. And let's say we claim that the limits to tolerance are intolerance, right? We don't tolerate the intolerant. Well, the trouble then is that by characterizing some group as being intolerant, as being beyond the limits of tolerance, we're saying it's okay for us to forcibly suppress that group. And so that characterization may therefore count as an intolerant act. At least, especially if we're saying that, intolerance isn't just a matter of action in the sense of like going around and beating people up, but intolerance can also be a matter of expressing certain beliefs. Um, and the issue here is that there's a very wide range of views about what exactly counts as intolerant. Indeed, any society that plausibly deserves the label tolerant will allow the expression of views that are, from the point of view of at least some people, intolerant. Consider, for instance, a group of religious people who argue in favour of blasphemy laws, or maybe more recently, the repackaging of blasphemy laws in terms of hate speech. Secularists are going to say that, well, this is clearly just this is just intolerance towards particular kinds of criticism of the religion. To say that something like, burning a religious book is a case of blasphemy or is a case of hate speech, to suppress the action of burning the religious book, that's intolerance of certain forms of criticism or mockery or whatever. The religious group may argue that, well, blasphemy is a form of intolerance towards the religion. Or consider libertarians who argue against civil rights protections on the grounds of freedom of association. They say private businesses should have the right to discriminate with respect to who uses their services, just as you have the right to discriminate with respect to who enters your home. As many people see it, the libertarian wishes to permit outright racial intolerance. But it seems like surely we want to allow them to express that view. Or consider, writers who are opposed to democracy. Maybe they favour some form of epistocracy, so that only people who show themselves to be sufficiently well informed about political and economic issues can vote, which of course would lead to the disenfranchisement of most of the population. I mean, again, there's going to be a lot of people who'd say, well, that would be an intolerant ideology. Or another example here is feminist opposition to pornography, on the grounds that pornography degrades and dehumanizes women. So on this example, the more sophisticated feminist critiques of pornography will argue that pornography itself is a form of intolerance, because pornography silences women. It creates social conditions where women are degraded and dehumanized, and thus their speech is not taken seriously, their speech is not heard properly. So Catherine McKinnon says that pornography strips and devastates women of credibility, from our accounts of sexual assault to our everyday reality of sexual subordination. We are stripped of authority and reduced and devalidated and silenced. I mean, here's one way this might happen. If we're dealing with pornography, let's say that the pornography that's commonly consumed depicts non-consensual situations. This may lead men to form the view that when women utter the word no in sexual contexts, they're not actually intending to refuse sex. So, in that case, women would no longer be able to communicate their refusal successfully. And thus, by creating that kind of social environment, pornography violates women's right to freedom of speech. Now, of course, I mean, this is a very controversial argument. What the sexual liberal will say is that this very position is intolerant of legitimate forms of expression. Now, surely we would want to allow both the feminist and the sexual liberal to express their views, but each views the other as holding an intolerant position. And each of them has, reasoned arguments in favour of what they're saying. So, we're told that the tolerant society cannot tolerate the intolerant. But there is a genuinely paradoxical flavour to this, given that any tolerant society must allow debate over which positions count as intolerant, and thus it must allow the expression of views for which there is a plausible case that can be made that those views are intolerant. You know, the feminist says pornography is intolerant of women, or perhaps outright violent against women, and thus must be prohibited. The sexual liberal says the feminist is intolerant of legitimate forms of expression. And so, you know, each is calling the other intolerant. I think, you know, I mean, clearly any society with a plausible claim to tolerance would not suppress either of these arguments. Now, actually, notice that it doesn't really help much here to go with Popper's view that intolerance must involve violence or the promotion of violence. Part of the reason for this is that violence is itself just another contested category. Again, feminist critiques of pornography often argue that pornography is a form of violence against women, or that it causes violence against women. So, you know, from this point of view, the liberal who argues in favour of pornography could be taken to be promoting violence. The other problem here is that the vast majority of people accept that violence is sometimes justified. Anybody arguing for the forcible suppression of anything is going to be arguing for violence. I mean, ultimately, if we have laws against pornography, or laws against discrimination, or laws against blasphemy, or whatever else, those laws will, in the end, be backed up by violence. So this was just a brief outline of some of these issues that arise with respect to the first paradox of intolerance. Now, before moving on, I'm just going to give a quick advert. So I have a Patreon on which I upload bonus videos. If you go onto the Hume tier on my Patreon, you can find a bunch of bonus content there. Or you can just send me some extra cash on PayPal if you want to support the channel. Anything you can offer, you know, it really does help. So I really appreciate that. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, a master's, a PhD in philosophy, so those are my qualifications. And I have a Discord. The links to all of this will be in the description. Okay, let's move on. So, second paradox. Second paradox. There are many cases where we tolerate not just things that we dislike, but things that we take to be outright morally wrong. As we've noted, tolerance requires opposition. A pluralist who grants that there are many legitimate ways of life would not be said to tolerate these other ways of life. You know, she's embracing them, she's encouraging them. For cases of tolerance, well, we need to think of, for instance, the anti-racist cosmopolitan who believes that people should nevertheless be free to express racist and tribal ideologies. Or, you know, the Christian who believes in the sanctity of all life, but at the same time opposes government regulation of abortion. Or a feminist who thinks that burqas and other face coverings are oppressive of women, but who believes that women should have the right to wear such things. Right? These are the sort of exemplary instances of tolerance. Now, the puzzle here is, you know, we're assuming that tolerance is a virtue, right? But now, suppose that X is morally wrong, okay? X ought not to happen. X ought not to exist. How then can it be good to permit X to exist? So essentially the puzzle here is this. If something is wrong and ought not to be done, how can it be good to allow it when it's within our power to prevent it? Tolerance makes things worse by allowing a wrongdoing that could have been prevented. So tolerance should not be viewed as a virtue. I mean, the basic worry here is that taking tolerance to be a virtue, it almost seems to come close to the claim that it's a good thing that wrongdoing occurs. And, you know, that's a rather puzzling claim, right? I mean, certainly there would be nothing virtuous about tolerating murder or theft, for instance. There'd be nothing virtuous about allowing those things to occur when it's within our power to prevent them. So how can there be anything virtuous about tolerating other things that we judge to be morally wrong? Well, I mean, obviously the first point here is that, you know, we can judge that something is wrong without judging that we should try to prevent the wrongdoing. So it would be better if the wrongdoing did not occur. However, this does not entail that it would be better if we sought to prevent the kind of wrongdoing in question. I mean, what this puzzle, I suppose, forces us to confront is the question of what exactly is the justification of tolerance supposed to be? You know, like, why is it that there are certain cases where we think that it is better not to prevent some wrongdoing, even when it's in our power to prevent the wrongdoing? So there are a few potential answers here. And first of all, there's a famous argument for tolerance that goes as follows. Let's suppose that my moral framework is the correct one. Suppose even that there can be no reasonable disagreement about it. Well, nevertheless, there still is disagreement whether I like it or not. People have different views. They want to act in different ways. Now, I could attempt to prevent all wrongdoing, but then by the same token, I will be doing things in my own life that people with different moral views consider wrong. So, they're going to attempt to resist my coercion of them, and then they in turn will try to coerce me, and I'm going to resist their attempts to coerce me, and so what we end up with is conflict, and that's really bad. Tolerance is a compromise to avoid perpetual strife. I accept some wrongdoing because the alternative is worse. Because if what I'm favouring is a society that clamps down on all wrongdoing, then what we end up with is just conflict between people who have different moral views, and we would prefer to avoid conflict. Now, this justification is of course somewhat unstable, in the sense that if the group with which I identify grows in power so that the opposition no longer poses any threats to us, then the potential costs of the threat of conflict are going to be much lower. I mean, like, if we become powerful enough, then we might just say, there's not actually any risk of conflict, right? Like, we can just clamp down on this wrongdoing and stamp it out, and that's it. There's no real risk here. And I mean, the other issue with this justification is that, well, for any case where we propose any kind of law, it could always be said that this is going to lead to further conflict. I mean, even in cases of laws against murder and theft, I mean, people can disagree with them or can attempt to resist those laws. People can disagree with or attempt to resist any law whatsoever, right? So this type of justification of tolerance maybe has quite limited application. Relatedly, there are also direct costs of preventing wrongdoing. So even when an action would be bad, the action of preventing X may itself have more immediate costs that would be even worse. Attempting to prevent wrongdoing can sometimes do more harm than good. Consider, for instance, drug prohibition. Suppose that drug use is wrong, and we now have laws against drug use. We have laws stamping it out. Even so, the opponents of prohibition will argue that prohibition creates, for instance, black markets that are then used to fund other criminal enterprises. Or prohibition ends up driving drug addicts into crime in order to maintain their addictions. Drug prohibition discourages addicts from seeking treatment. Drug prohibition ends up leading to an intrusive and authoritarian police force, and so on. So the argument from the anti-prohibitionist is that there are serious costs for any society that's intolerant of drug use. And of course, the general point here is we have to weigh the benefit of eliminating wrongdoing against the potential harms caused by the act of prevention. In many cases, the act of prevention would be objectionably harmful. Now, again, this justification of tolerance has obvious limits. If we discovered an easy, cheap, reliable way to prevent the behaviour, then this justification would no longer hold. So we again only get a fairly limited defence of tolerance. In fact, for our purposes, there's a more significant problem with these justifications of tolerance, which is that they are only, let's say, instrumentalist justifications. Many people who have more liberal attitudes, many people in the liberal tradition, think that tolerance is worthwhile in itself, beyond its mere instrumental benefits. Indeed, tolerance is a virtue even when it's not instrumentally useful. But neither of these arguments are going to do anything to show that tolerance is worthwhile in itself. In fact, we might think that, strictly speaking, these arguments don't really bear on tolerance at all, as we've defined tolerance. Because in cases where the costs of preventing X outweigh the cost of X itself, perhaps we shouldn't really speak of tolerance as an option, because these will be cases where the power condition is not satisfied, right? Like, remember, what's required for tolerance is, you know, opposition to, like, we tolerate X when we oppose X, when we have the power to prevent X, but when we nevertheless accept X. But in cases where the cost of preventing X is sufficiently high, then it's not clear that we really have the power to prevent X, at least in the relevant sense. Now, we don't really have the power to suppress X when attempting to suppress X will just lead to endless conflict, or when attempting to suppress X will, you know, lead to even more sort of serious problems further down the line. You know, I mean, that's a case where actually our powers are significantly limited. So maybe this is just not even, you know, really relevant to tolerance as we're, you know, using the term. There is, however, a certain class of costs, let's say, to preventing tolerance that are of more philosophical significance. So Horton, for instance, he argues that the problem with intolerance lies in the way that it limits self-determination and autonomy. So we take it that there is a value in permitting people to make their own choices, even when they end up choosing the wrong thing. There is a value in people making up their own minds and having control over their own lives. You know, sometimes the harms of the action that a person intends to perform more than outweigh the harms of interfering with their autonomy. Say when a person wants to commit murder or rape or something, but not always, right? Like, there are cases where where we want to say, all right, like, it's a good thing, it's valuable for people to sort of have this autonomy and control over their own lives and their own decision making and to come to their own conclusions and so on. That's something that's valuable in itself. And yes, you know, they will sometimes make the wrong decision. They will do things that are morally wrong, but still the value of autonomy outweighs that. So we shouldn't interfere in those cases. So this would be certainly a justification of tolerance that is not merely instrumental. The problem is that this way of putting it seems to be little more than just restating in different terms the claim that tolerance is a virtue. I mean, one way to bring this out is to note that if some action X is wrong, then ordinarily we would think that the fact that X is freely chosen is worse, right? Like, somebody who is coerced into doing wrong, or somebody who does wrong unintentionally, is usually viewed less negatively than somebody who intentionally does it. I mean, compare a person who, like, I don't know, creates sexist art without realizing that it's sexist. You know, that this person it's somebody who's like, actually, they're not sexist, right? You know, they're committed to equality between men and women. They want to treat everybody with respect, but they just end up kind of accidentally, because maybe they're just being thoughtless or something. They end up, you know, creating this artwork that, you know, depicts women in a sexist way or something like that. Yeah, right. So now compare that to somebody who intentionally creates the sexist artwork, right? They want to depict women in this sexist way. We'd probably judge that the intentional sexist artwork is worse, right? That they've done something worse than the unintentional sexism. So, so the thing is like, yes, we do value self-determination and autonomy, but it's not clear that this really is like an independent justification for tolerance of wrongdoing. Maybe this is, you know, to say that we value autonomy is little more than saying in different terms that we value tolerance. So that might be a worry there. Okay, then, let's turn to the third paradox. As we have seen, people cannot be tolerant of things that they positively value, that they consider to be good. It only makes sense to say that you tolerate X in cases where you disapprove of X. If I think that pornography is morally wrong, I might nevertheless tolerate pornography. If I think that pornography is perfectly acceptable, there's no question of tolerating it. So how tolerant a person is will therefore depend on the things to which they have a negative attitude. As Horton puts it, the wider the scope of negative attitudes, the wider the scope for practicing toleration. So consider two people, Verity and Sydney. Verity thinks that pornography is morally wrong, but that it should be tolerated. Sydney thinks that pornography is perfectly fine, right? So the question of tolerance doesn't arise. But later, they both change their minds. Verity comes to the view that pornography is totally acceptable, so Verity is no longer tolerant of pornography. Not because she's become intolerant, but because the question of tolerance ceases to arise for her. Sydney comes to the view that pornography is morally wrong, but should be tolerated. So, it should be it shouldn't be prohibited, right? So Sydney can be said to be tolerant of pornography. We have the result that Verity has become less tolerant, while Sydney has become more tolerant. Moreover, it seems like Sydney could properly be described as being more tolerant the stronger his negative attitude to pornography is. But this is rather strange, right? Because Verity has lost a negative attitude while Sydney has gained a negative attitude, and so it's like um, to say that Verity has become less tolerant while Sydney has become more tolerant seems like the wrong way to put this. And I notice that I'm looking at the slide that I've written here, and I've written that the wrong way round at the bottom there. I've said, so Verity becomes more tolerant and Sydney becomes less tolerant. This is a strange result. That should say, so Verity becomes less tolerant and Sydney becomes more tolerant. And that's the strange result. Okay, so, but anyway, this is the paradox, right? Is that it seems like by having more negative views, by having more like disapproval, you end up creating more space for being tolerant, and so you could be said to be more tolerant the more attitudes of disapproval you hold, and that almost seems the wrong way round. Notice actually, so this also raises a challenge for some of the ideas that justify political liberalism. I mean, a central idea of political liberalism is that the state should be neutral between conflicting conceptions of the good. And part of the point of liberalism is to allow people to pursue their own conceptions of the good. Like, we create a space within which a variety of views of the good life can flourish. But then we might say that the liberal state is not really a tolerant state. I mean, compare, for instance, an explicitly religious state, say a Christian state that that nevertheless permits other religions to be practiced, right? Like this is a state where like the good life is the Christian life, and it takes steps to, promote this view, but it tolerates people who hold different views, right? The liberal state, at least as liberals often put it, the way they often argue for it, is not like that. The liberal state is supposed to be neutral between different conceptions of the good life. So since the liberal state does not object to these various different conceptions of the good, since it's supposed to be neutral between them, it can't really be said to be tolerating them. So, if that's right, then contrary to common opinion, tolerance is not one of the foundational ideals of liberalism. Rather, political liberalism rests on a different moral claim, maybe the claim that there are various acceptable ways of life or whatever. Alternatively, of course, we might take liberalism to be committed to more substantive values, to favouring a specific conception of the good, which entails, tolerance of some other conceptions of the good. But in that case, we can't claim that the liberal state is neutral between these conceptions of the good. So, I mean, the challenge is we have to choose between, tolerance of other conceptions of the good and neutrality between conceptions of the good. You can't have both. All right then, a fourth paradox. This is kind of an extension of the third paradox. So, again, we're taking it that tolerance is a virtue. Now consider a person who is a virulent racist. They believe that black people are intellectually inferior. They believe that interracial marriage will lead to a decline in the physical and mental capacity of humankind. They encourage through argument that races do not intermix, and so on. But this person is also committed to the idea that people should be permitted to make their own decisions about their relationships and about their own lives, and so this person is opposed to any attempts to prohibit interracial marriage. Now what we have here is seemingly a paradigmatic case of tolerance. The racist tolerates interracial marriage despite their strongly negative judgment towards it. Now if tolerance is a virtue, we have the paradox that an immoral belief, namely the racist disapproval of interracial marriage, is a component of a moral virtue. Indeed, it seems we have to say that the more strongly the racist endorses their racist views, the more tolerant they are, which is a counterintuitive result. We don't want to say that racists can, in virtue of their racism, exemplify the virtue of tolerance. This also has the odd consequence that if the racist were to abandon their racism, they would become less tolerant, and in this particular respect, sort of lose something that's a virtue. Though of course we may still judge that that would be outweighed by the benefits of giving up their racism. So is this paradoxical? Well, I mean, one response we might make to this is, okay, look, tolerance is a virtue, but we might argue that virtues can be involved in evil ends or evil actions. So we might say, I mean, arguably, that a murderer who carefully plans their crimes, who takes risks, but is also intelligent about those risks. Let's say we might say that this murderer exhibits the virtues of intelligence and bravery. Intelligence because they carefully consider various possible plans and take sensible measures not to get caught. Bravery because the stakes are very high for them. They risk life in prison. So these are virtuous character traits, but here they are being used for evil ends. Maybe the same sort of thing can arise in the case of tolerance. In any case, in the case of tolerance, it's actually not being used for a bad end. Surely it's better that a racist be tolerant than that the racist be intolerant. So in the case of the tolerant racist, it's not that tolerance is being put to a bad use. The tolerance has positive consequences. It's a good thing that the racist is restraining their racism in this way. It would be better still if the racist gave up their racist beliefs, and then, okay, they would no longer exemplify the virtue of tolerance in this respect. So the thought would just generally be that there isn't really anything paradoxical about like an immoral belief being a component of a moral virtue. Still, I mean, we might still think there's something counterintuitive about this notion of a tolerant racist. So here's an alternative approach. We noted at the start that tolerance involves opposition. And we might add that in order to manifest tolerance, opposition must be based on good reasons. So this is the line that Horton takes. He says, "For restraint to manifest the virtue of tolerance, the objection to the conduct or practice that is being tolerated must itself not be unreasonable or without value." So racial prejudice cannot be a component of tolerance. Given that prejudice is unjustified, tolerance involves not just permitting races to coexist peacefully, but removing the prejudiced attitude. We can't really be said to exhibit tolerance when that's based on racial prejudice, because racial prejudice itself is not based on good reasons. If we take this option, then notice that we would forego the possibility of giving a purely sort of formal characterization of tolerance. We would need some substantive moral theory that specifies what counts as a good objection to other ways of life. Okay, fifth paradox, the final one that we will discuss. There is a paradox that arises concerning the justification of tolerance within a tolerant society. This is discussed by Samuel Scheffler in his article, The Good of Toleration. Okay, we've seen that there are instrumental arguments for tolerance, which might allow us to defend tolerance on self-interested grounds. These are only going to work if tolerance continues to be an effective means to the benefits that are adduced for it. We might hope for more, for a justification of tolerance that shows it to be a virtue in itself, even when it's not, immediately promoting your interests. Now, there's a general problem with giving such an argument for tolerance. This argument would have to begin by appealing to some set of moral principles. But in that case, we are defending tolerance by appealing to a moral framework that is just one moral framework among many that are found within the society. And this moral framework can't be assumed to be privileged within the context of discussion. After all, the whole point of talking about this is that we are talking to people. The whole point of talking about tolerance is that we're talking with people who have potentially very different moral frameworks to us. So if we're attempting to defend tolerance from its opponents, we're talking to people who hold different moral positions to us. But then for the people who hold these different positions, they may now legitimately reject whatever argument we give for tolerance, because they can point out, well, look, tolerance is following from moral principles that we oppose. So the argument for tolerance is going to appeal to some moral framework, but then we're in a discussion with people who hold very different moral frameworks, and so they're just going to say, well, we just don't accept that framework, right? I mean, one way to put the challenge is this. We're claiming that we have like a society that sort of allows these various different positions to be held. The tolerant regime is one where there's a space in which many different moral frameworks can be explored and can flourish. The tolerant regime can be justified only by appealing to some moral principle or other. But consider how this justification looks to people who hold different moral principles. As Scheffler puts it, partisans of opposing principles are likely to claim that a regime of toleration that is justified in this way is a sham. Although superficially tolerant of diverse outlooks, it is, at a more fundamental level, biased in favour of a particular moral outlook which supports that regime for its own sectarian reasons. The tolerant society is just one conception of the good among many. And note that this problem is even more serious if, in response to the fourth paradox, we give up on this purely formal characterization of tolerance, right? In that case, tolerance itself requires a substantive moral theory, not just for its justification, but for the very characterization of what counts as tolerance in the first place. So there may well be something kind of paradoxical about the attempt to defend tolerance in the context of, a society in which we're supposedly claiming that many different moral views are are to be allowed to flourish. Okay, so that was just an initial introduction to some of these paradoxes of tolerance. I'm going to end the video there. I hope you found that interesting, and I'll see you next time. All right, goodbye, everybody.